Um, like many of us, Pete Leach started out building scale model airplanes, spacecraft, boats, and ships early in his life. He moved to model railroading 40 or so years ago, although he was admittedly a lone wolf modeler for the first 30 of his 40 years in the hobby. In 2012, Pete moved to Tomball, Texas, a suburb just northwest of Houston. Following his move to Texas, Pete became involved in the Houston area model railroad community. He joined the Petticoat Junction group in 2014, and as a member of that group, Pete first met the organizers of the 2015 National Narrow Gauge Convention. The first open house for his Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railroad was during the 2015 National Narrow Gauge Convention. In 2016, Pete joined the San Jacinto or San Jack Model Railroad Club in Houston, and being a 100% NMRA club, Pete became an NMRA member. And since joining the NMRA, Pete has given clinics on a variety of subjects and has won awards for his modeling at the Lone Star Region Convention. Pete's model of a sailing ship won Best of Show at the 2018 Lone Star Region Convention. Pete's articles have been published in local, regional, and national publications, and most recently in the Gazette. And for those of you who have just received your July-August issue, there's another fine article from Pete on a main 2-foot boxcar. Just 3 years after joining the NMRA, Pete has earned his Master Model Railroader designation. He's number 649, and Pete currently serves on the board of directors of the Lone Star region. So Pete, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for that nice introduction. Can you see the screen here?
We can.
Yes. Oh, perfect. I love it when the plan comes together. Thank you, Russ and the team, for keeping these meetings going every month. It's really appreciated. Welcome, everyone, to my clinic on building of my dream layout, but in a downsized space. I have an ON30 layout based on a main 2-foot prototype, the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway. My layout is a lot smaller than I dreamed, and I'm going to show you how I designed the layout and use some techniques to get the most of my smaller space. I'm going to give you a virtual tour of the finished layout, along with some of the basic constructions I used. I'm going to give you some information about the prototype that inspired me and how I incorporated some of its history into the design. But first, a little background. I started model railroading a little later than a lot of you. It was around 1980. I was in my mid-20s. Before I got into model railroading, I built a lot of scale models in my youth, starting with plastic kits of planes, spacecraft, and ships. By my teens, I was scratch building everything from wooden sailing ships to Egyptian reed boats. But then I purchased some used N-scale equipment from a consignment table at a local hobby shop, and I was off and running with my new hobby. I built, or should say partially built, several layouts over the years. This was one of my later efforts that included a double-track main line through a Midwestern town. The track curves through a hole in the backdrop to a double-ended staging track in the back. Then in 1988, I stumbled across this book, 2 Feet to Tidewater, by Robert Jones and David Register. This was the story of the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway. I'll be honest, I'd never heard of this railroad at the time, but I was captivated by the illustration on the dust jacket. It had a small steam locomotive on a trestle, pulling a string of wooden cars in front of buildings along the waterfront. Well, I bought the book and it became the inspiration for my dream layout. Let me give you a brief history of the railroad. So the town leaders of Wiscasset, Maine wanted to build a railroad to connect their seaport to Canada. The railroad was chartered as the Wiscasset in Quebec in 1854. After 40 years of talking and fundraising, and mostly talking, construction was started around 1894 from Wiscasset using the popular 2-foot gauge standard. They tried reaching Canada by 2 different routes with no luck. They settled on a 40-plus mile route up the Sheepscot River Valley to serve the lumber and agricultural industries. So the railroad built the line north here from Wiscasset up the Sheepscot River Valley, all the way to Burnham Junction at the top. They were stopped by the Maine Central, who refused to allow them to build a crossing at grade. So they abandoned the line back to Albion. Then they focused on building a line northwest from Weeks Mills at a Y through Waterville and on to Farmington, where they'd hoped to hook up with the Sandy River line. At that point, they reorganized the railroad as the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington. Once again, they were foiled by the Maine Central before they reached Waterville. So this line was eventually abandoned too. They never actually made it to Quebec, Farmington, or Waterville. So my dream was to build a layout based on the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Railway. And I tried to follow the path of David Frary and Bob Hayden and their HON 30 Carabasset and Dead River. But I quickly found my modeling skills weren't up to the task of getting an HON 30 Forney locomotive to run. I built a lot of dioramas. So I kept working on various N-scale layouts. But after decades of trying and failing, in early 2011, I stumbled across a Bachmann model of a Maine 2-foot style Forney. It was at the Amherst show in West Springfield, Mass. But it was an ON 30. So was it time to switch scales? Well, I purchased the Bachmann model and a few cars. I brought it home and laid some flex track on the floor of my basement in New Hampshire and tested it. I was blown away how great this model ran and sounded. So I started tearing down my N-scale layout within days and started construction of what I thought would be my dream layout in my 14-foot by 22-foot basement. I even sketched several track plan ideas. This is one of my last ones with Wiscasset up here on the upper right. I don't know if you can see this laser pointer. And it goes down through Wiscasset, around the corner, through the town of Head Tide, over an iron bridge into Whitefield, around the center column post, through Palermo, between the water heater and furnace. We always have those obstructions, don't we? And around the corner to the town of Albion. Now, this wasn't the full 40 miles, but I thought it'd be plenty enough to keep me busy for years to come. After decades of modeling an N-scale, switching to O required some adjustments to my thinking. I built a small test layout to help me practice everything from track laying to scenery, because everything was different. Then in January of 2012, my wife and I decided to relocate from New Hampshire to Houston, Texas. We wanted to follow our 2 grown sons as they migrated to Houston after college. We also wanted to use the opportunities to downsize. We weren't retiring, but we did want to get rid of a lot of stuff and get a smaller house. So I gave up a clean, dry basement in New Hampshire for a clean, dry bedroom in Texas. On our final walkthrough of the house that we purchased, we came to the spare bedroom and my wife said, "You can do your trains in here, right?" "Sure," I said, thinking to myself, what am I going to do with this 10-foot by 12-foot space? Oh, and it had a closet door that opened into the room. So the question I asked myself, could I build my dream layout in a space that was just a fraction of my original plan? So I sat down to list what was important to me in designing and building this layout. First, it needed to satisfy my need to build models. I still tell people I'm a modeler with a railroad. And it needed to be based on the prototype. I wanted to include as many structures, locomotives, rolling stock, even scenery and operations as on the prototype, but with liberal doses of selective compression, selective relocation, and of course, selective omission. The layout would be in a spare bedroom on the main part of the house. So I had to leave it in there, no tunneling through the walls allowed. A lot of people suggested that. And for the same reason, the layout room must remain presentable during the build. Unlike a basement of the past where I could close the door and hide my mess, I wanted to be able to leave the door open so visitors of the house could see what I was working on. And there would be no rush to complete it. This could take as long as I needed. This could even be my forever layout. So taking a cue from John Armstrong and his Givens and Druthers, I listed my layout goals. First, to build a layout focused on Wiscasset to include that waterfront scene from the dust jacket of the book. I needed to include the narrow gauge station and the main central crossing nearby, mainly because I'd already built the station. I wanted a turntable with a runaround track so I could build up a train and send it out of town. If I could include a small area for a wharf, it would be a great plus. It also must include some type of destination, a place to send the trains. Open staging would be fine, but I wanted to be able to turn the engines and run around the train and send them back into Wiscasset. Another town to model would be a great if room permitted. I really wanted to include some form of operations, switching and car forwarding. This is something I've done on my N-scale layouts, and I wanted to try to include it here. So I started to think, what could I do with this space? Well, I could build 20-inch wide shelves along the top and the bottom, and then 15 to 18-inch wide shelves over here on the side in front of a 6.5-foot wide window that goes from knee-high to above my head. Then I could include the town of Wiscasset in these two walls, and then have open staging over here. But then my wife asked one day, why don't you just build across the closet door? Well, I really wanted to keep access to the closet. It would be a great place to store all my modeling supplies and kits and all those failures of past efforts. So I drew up a plan with the benchwork across the door. And this allowed me to shift the town of Wiscasset over to these two walls. And I could include that waterfront scene, the crossing and narrow gauge station, a runaround track and turntable, and a small area for a wharf. Oh, and I can include an actual town as my destination. I'd like to share some of the 6 lessons I've learned by downsizing. Number 1, make the most of whatever space is available. So if you remember that closet door, well, I didn't want to give up access to the closet. So I built this section on casters. It allows me to roll it out of the way. I got the idea from a model railroader project layout called the beer line. I have wood dowels to keep the sections aligned, brass suitcase latches to hold them together, and a 4-pin connector to carry the track bus and low voltage power for the structure lighting. Here's another example of using what could be unusable space. I built a 3-inch wide shelf that goes behind the entry door and gives me an extra 30 inches of track and a spot for another industry. As I worked on spanning that 6.5-foot wide window, I realized I could extend the joist 6 inches into the open space. Not only did I have more room for scenery, but it also helped to ease the curves leading into it from the 2 corners. The second lesson I figured out was find techniques to make the layout appear bigger. So forced perspective uses optical illusion to make an object appear farther away. I'd heard of this technique, but had never really tried it. So let me give you a few examples of how I use forced perspective on my layout. In this scene in Albion, Maine, Benton Road runs by the station and crosses the track. Up the road there is an HO scale truck. And then I have a smaller, like half-scale size telephone pole. So this actually gives both the illusion of some distance here. But the truck is only 9 inches from the passenger car. The key is to limit the view of up the road. If I move my head a little to the left or right, the vegetation and the trees, they hide the truck. The truck also covers the spot in the road where it ends against the backdrop. This is another scene given depth using forced perspective. So back there on the left against the backdrop is an N-scale house I cut in half diagonally. And over on the right is an HO scale house also cut in half. Now the distance from the fascia to the backdrop is about 22 inches. Modeling this scene was inspired by Bob Hayden, who visited my layout during the 2015 narrow gauge convention here in Houston. When looking at my layout under construction with an early version of the crossing, he said, you know, you have some room for some of the main central buildings here. Not wanting to disappoint one of the hobby icons, I worked at seeing what could fit into the space. Forced perspective technique allowed me to add this scene in what otherwise wouldn't fit. Here's a look behind the curtain. So the standard gauge main central tracks, as they approach the back, they narrow and curve away. This walkway platform, the boards get shorter and narrower. Same with the handrail. This front part of the depot is built to S scale, and it starts here in the back at S scale and tapers to HO. I do need to add some more trees over here to hide the view, but otherwise I think it worked out pretty well. Another illusion that can give a sense of distance is a good backdrop. But a poorly executed backdrop is just a distraction. And here's an example of a poorly executed backdrop on my layout. This is how the scene looked during my open house at the 2015 narrow gauge convention. So the track runs along here. You can see this brown line with a little bit of silver there. And behind it, you can see where the scenery meets the backdrop. After the convention, a friend pointed me to a series of YouTube videos by Chris Lyon. I watched the videos a couple of times and decided to give it a try. I bought a few artist brushes and some acrylic paints at a local craft store. You can check out Chris's videos yourself on his YouTube channel, CNLVN. And this was the result. Now, the only thing added to this scene is paint on the backdrop. There was no additional scenery materials added here. Oh, and if anyone would like to learn how to paint these backdrops, I'm doing a make and take clinic in Hickory this September. Please sign up when we get closer, as each of the 2 sessions are limited to 8 participants, but everyone's welcome to watch. I've expanded on Chris's idea by adding photos of houses and barns to the backdrop. For this scene, I Googled houses in Wiscasset. I pasted the images into our Word document, sized them, printed them, cut them out. Then it was a matter of attaching and blending them in. I think it adds some life to this scene. The third lesson I learned is the importance of making the layout feel longer. This would be difficult if I was modeling a high-speed Class 1 railroad, but narrow gauge certainly lends itself to these techniques. The first thing I like to do is add real work. By real, I mean something physical the crew needs to do, not just standing there waiting for a designated time period. One way I did it was by adding a simple mechanical system to animate the water spout in Albion. This wood knob along the front is a bracket for a closet pole I purchased at one of the DIY big box stores. I flipped it around and I fed a 1/4-inch threaded rod through it and into a simple socket under the tank. Turning the knob winds a string that pulls up the spout. So the crew just needs to position the loco under the water spout, and turning the knob and the F6 function, which is programmed on my decoders to add the sound of the water stop. When the crew thinks they have enough, they press F6 and turn the crank back to raise the spout. This simple activity only lasts about a minute, but adds interest and time to any short run. Switching moves and station stops are another way to add time. On the prototype, the milk was an important source of revenue. The Turner Center Dairying Association had a ramp and a small dwelling in Albion. 2 employees of the dairy lived and worked out of the house, Ken Thurston and Vern Stearns. Each morning, they would move cans of milk left on the ramp by local farmers into the reefer. Then the railroad crew would add the car into the morning mixed train for Wiscasset. One of the employees would ride the 40+ miles to Wiscasset inside the reefer. That's Vern loading the milk this morning. And if the train crew spotted milk cans on any of the platforms, they would stop, and the dairy employee would jump out, load them into the reefer. Upon arrival in Wiscasset, he would work in the creamery until the last northbound headed back to Albion. He would need to drop off clean, empty cans to replace the full cans he picked up earlier. Here, Vern is getting his work done quickly so he can keep to the train schedule. Adding this simple activity can realistically extend the runs on a small layout. The crew needs to keep their eyes open for any of those shiny cans on the platform of this milk stop. Before I talk about the rest of my downsizing lessons, let's take a look at the construction of the layout. Here is an early view of Wiscasset waterfront. This is the 5-foot-long trestle that was scratch built to carry the track across the waterfront. Those structures along the waterfront were built based on the artwork of that book's dust jacket. They would be replaced later when scale drawings were found. The station on the right was built before the move to Texas. Here's how that movable section in front of the closet looked during the 2015 convention.
Yeah.
Sorry, somebody was talking. That white building in the distance is a full-scale mock-up of the Roundhouse I planned to build. The mock-up stayed on the layout for many years. I used a lot of full-size mock-ups during the design and building of the layout. That flat car that sits on the spur that will become my wharf, but here it's just a pine board. Here is the town of Albion during construction. I would place rolling stock and engines into the scene to check the fit and views. Changes to the track or structure placement are much easier now than in a finished scene. And note the large white mock-up of the station on the right. There it is again on the left. But here are some of the details of my construction methods. I used L girder with joists, and I placed the rear L girder against the wall and secured it with screws into the studs. And since I was hand laying track, I used Homosote on 1/2-inch plywood. My track is about 57 inches above the floor. Having track this high also gives the illusion of depth. My track is hand laid using micro engineering code 83 rail on hand cut 1/8 by 1/8 inch wood ties. My turnouts are handmade using a fast tracks jig, and they're controlled with caboose throws with a few blue points thrown in hard to reach areas. So as I built, I started to refine the plan. First, I was able to add the flag stop over here, which you saw. So remember, if the crew sees those milk cans on the platform, they better stop. And then I was able to increase the bump out for my wharf and build some ships over there. So let's take a tour of the finished layout. Here's a high-level view as you enter the room. The center of the room is open, so it doesn't feel very cramped. You may have noticed this other layout under my layout. This is the Peterborough and Lucasville Railroad. It is being built by my 2 grandsons using leftover equipment and materials from my N-scale days. They work on it during sleepovers and Sunday dinners. This was also the inset photo in the article published about my layout in the November-December 2020 Gazette. My grandsons now like to remind me that a photo of their layout was published in the Gazette too. Let's start at the top, Albion, Maine at milepost 43.5. Along the top is my track plan. Below is a panoramic shot of the 12-foot wall. Included are the Portland Cannery, the 2-story station, a single-stall engine house, a turntable, a small coal shed, and behind that, the Turner ramp, the potato warehouse, and the Crosby water tank. So here's that shelf behind the door again, and here it is now finished. The end of the track is to the right of the cannery. The north of here is where the prototype pulled up the rails that were laid to Burnham Junction. The Portland Cannery was selectively relocated to the opposite side of the tracks and built as a flat against the backdrop. So the 2 peaked roofs represent husking sheds that were used by local labor to shuck peas, husk corn, etc., to supply the canning operations, mostly in July to fall. And remember that shot of Albion under construction. Here it is today. The view includes the entire 9-foot length of the Albion yard. Oh, and that HO scale truck I showed earlier is out of sight behind the vegetation. The green building peeking out on the left is the 2-story station that was unique on the railroad. The model was scratch built and includes interior details with lighting on both floors. The station was originally built with a single story, but at some point the railroad jacked up the roof and installed a second floor to be used as a residence for the agent and other employees of the line. This is the side that most people never get to see as it faces away from the aisle. Also, there were no commercial window castings of the correct size for this, so I scratch built them using microscope slide cover slip glass and strips of wood. On previous layouts, I wouldn't have finished the back of the structure, but that would have limited its use on any future layouts, and it always would feel unfinished. Here's a photo I took of the actual station during the 2016 convention in Augusta, Maine. At one point, it was sinking into the mud and was about to fall over, but the local historical society is working to restore the station to its former glory. One of the key reasons I picked Albion as the destination town is because it had an engine service facility with a turntable. As you can see, this is a nice compact scene. I scratch built the single stall engine house using a drawing by fellow Maine 2-foot enthusiast Jeff Bissonette. The sides are clapboards and the ends are covered with wood shingles. This was common practice in much of New England. Modeling an O-scale gives me the opportunity and the obligation to include interior details with lighting. I still have some details I can add, but I'm happy with it so far. This engine house has doors that swing inside, likely to prevent them from being blocked by snow piling up in the winter. But a strange fact about this engine house, they built it too short and they can't close the doors when they park a locomotive inside. So much for Yankee engineering, huh? The turntable was also scratch built using a lot of pre-stained wood and nut and bolt washers. Just like the prototype, it's operated manually. I used a Digitrax AR1 to control polarity on both of my turntables on my DCC layout. The yard has a coal shed to keep the supply of fuel for the locomotives and railroad stoves. I used photos of the prototype to make the drawing so I could scratch build the model. The man on the coal load is moving it to the shed. In the early 1900s in this part of Maine, manual labor was common and cheap. This is a potato warehouse I scratch built from a Peter Barney drawing. Peter is a longtime researcher, author, and model builder of all things Maine 2-foot. He is also one of the folks I consult with regarding the accuracy of my models. This structure was selectively compressed and selectively relocated from another part of town. Potato warehouses like this were built up and down the line. They allowed the crop to be stored, keeping the product available year-round and prices more consistent, sort of like grain elevators today. Here's a simple stack of sawn lumber called box boards. There were several sawmills located near the railroad, but none on the railroad. So local mills would haul their lumber by wagon or truck and stack it along the right-of-way to dry. Then it would be loaded onto flat cars or boxcars for the trip to Wiscasset and on to other parts of the Northeast. Lumber is a major source of traffic for the railroad. These boards came by way of nearby Chalmers Mills. They will end up as wood boxes or crates somewhere in the Northeast. Oh, and that barn in the background is called Swanson's Farm, in honor of modeler and author Sam Swanson. He took this photo when driving around the countryside during the convention in Augusta, Maine, and he was kind enough to share it with me. Layout lighting was a big challenge in this room. So the ceiling varies in height between 8 feet back here in the corner, going up to 10 feet at the peak. Unlike basement layouts of the past, I couldn't simply hang some 4-foot fluorescent fixtures from the ceiling. And the ceilings were too high for track lighting. So I took an idea I've seen on some modular groups layouts and used swing arm desk lamps with 5,000 Kelvin LED bulbs. They light the layout well, and it's also nice I can reposition them when taking photos. Here's the system I developed to hang the lamps. So I started by attaching a 1x2 cleat to the wall with a groove on the back to hold the upper edge of the backdrop. The bottom of the backdrop is actually pinned against the wall with the joists on my L girders, so the backdrops have no screws through them at all. Then I covered this with a 5.5-inch strip of masonite, and then I could attach the base for the lamps. And I left a channel along the top that I could tuck in the wiring and hide that. Here's the water tank I showed earlier with the animated spout. This was also scratch built using another Peter Barney drawing. So the railroad located this tank on Crosby's farm so they could tap into the natural water source and not have to deal with the town water. The tank was located 1/4 mile away from the yard, so it wasn't convenient for the crews. This also marks the southern end of the yard limit for Albion. The next stop is Prebbles, milepost 15.7. Milk stops are essentially flag stop stations where milk cans serve as the flag. Here it is on the track plan. This is the part that was recessed into the window area. The station at Prebbles is a laser kit from Gary Kohler's Portland Locomotive Works company. This is one of the few kits on my layout, but it's a good one and is based on the prototype. That truck is a 1/43 scale die-cast delivery van that I cut the back off and replaced it with a flatbed I scratch built from wood. I have both 1/43 and 1/48 scale trucks on my layout, but it's important not to place them next to each other because you need to hide the fact that they're different scales. To the left of Prebbles is an area I call the swamp. I purchased a 3D moose, printed moose from Gary's Portland Locomotive Works because what's more Maine than a moose? This is also the first time I ever poured model water on any layout. Before this, I either didn't include water in the design or never got around to modeling it before I tore it down. So the water is Envirotex Light. I added some of the same paint concoction I use on the backdrops between layers of the water to give a little bit of a pond scum. If you look closely, you can see some close to the pond lilies. And the cattails and pond lilies are from JTT Scenery. So that brings me to Downsizing Lesson 4. There will be more time to add details on a smaller layout. One of the details I wanted and challenges I faced when building this layout was the lack of available eastern white pine tree models. Maine is known as the pine tree state, and having these types of trees on a layout was a must. I tried several ideas to build them, but all failed. But then a conversation I had with modeler Trevor Marshall pointed me to a post on Ryan Mendel's old blog showing a method that worked well for me. So the materials used are pictured on the left. I have dried caspia here on the left that I just got at a craft store. 2 colors of short, dark static grass. I think this is 2.5 millimeter. Some Aleene's tacky glue. Some of this brown camouflage paint, which is great to make rusty metal, by the way. And the ever popular cheap unscented hairspray, Extra Hold. On the lower right are the steps I used to build these. So the trunk is shaped. Then I've attached caspia branches into holes that were drilled into the trunk. Then it's sprayed with brown paint. And then it gets applications of hairspray and static grass. I formed the trunks from branches my wife cut from her hibiscus shrub. They have a great bark-like texture. Wood dowels would work here too. On to Wiscasset. This is a map from the Main Central showing the routes of the 2 railroads through town. The first into town was the Lincoln and Knox, later part of the Main Central. They came up the coast from Portland and into Wiscasset over here on the left. Being the first into town, they got their choice of the best ground. And as they passed through, then they curved off to the right and crossed the Sheepscot River on a trestle and bridge headed to Rockland. The narrow gauge had a tougher time since they were the last into town. They were forced to build in the water. So their line comes down from Albion in the north, crosses a tidal basin on a wooden trestle, crosses the Main Central at grade. Then it reaches the waterfront on a long trestle built into the river, hits dry land at the transfer yard, and then ends up at the railroad wharf at the far south end. Another important area for the narrow gauge in Wiscasset was located north of that tidal basin. Here the railroad's main yard, shop, and engine facility was located. I didn't have room for this, but I selectively relocated the 3-stall engine house, the turntable, and the coal shed to the other end of town. Here's my final track plan for Wiscasset. Oh, in case you're wondering, my track plan was drawn using my high school drafting set from 1972 and some colored pencils I bought from Walmart. I've used various CAD systems in the past, but decided to go full low-tech on this layout. And here's the panoramic view of the town, including the key elements of that tidal basin, the station and main central crossing, the waterfront scene, the turntable engine service facility selectively relocated from the other side of town, transfer yard and runaround in the back, and my wharf. So starting back at the tidal basin, this is one of my favorite parts of Maine. The coast, along the coast are tidal basins. The tides rise and fall 9 to 11 feet in Wiscasset. I set my layout at about 2 feet below high tide. So here the tide is ebbing or going out, exposing a muddy area around and behind this trestle, forming a tidal basin. It continues around to the back of the station seen on the left. In this scene, a local is digging for clams as the tide recedes, while some local wildlife waits for their chance at some leftovers. Here's a full view of the station in Wiscasset. It was scratch built using drawings by Wes Ewell, published in a May-June 2008 Gazette. The covered platform on the left was shortened one span to better fit the space. There's railroad initials that are painted on this side of the roof. Then they could only be seen by folks coming southbound on the main central. That sure sounds like an awful lot of effort for a little payback. This small lean-to on the far right is the outhouse that emptied into the tidal basin below. It's a good thing the tide goes in and out 2 times a day. Here's a view from the other end. Adding details to the flat platform brings the scene to life, even after dark. I don't run the railroad in the dark, but sometimes it's fun to turn the lights down and just have structure lighting. Here at the end of the station is the entire signal system for the railroad. The ball signal protected the crossing of the 2 railroads. The rule book stated if 2 balls were visible, the narrow gauge could occupy the crossing. And if only one was visible, the standard gauge had the right of way. I used the same threaded rod animation system as on the water tank to raise and lower the ball signal on the right. So my road crews need to keep an eye on the signal to prevent any mishaps, such as what happened on September 23rd, 1913, when a Main Central northbound overran the signal. Dairy car 73 was fouling the diamond, and the Main Central engine was struck broadside. This became known as the milk car wreck of 1913. So this is the image from the book 2 Feet to Tidewater. And you can see reefer number 73 was destroyed, scattering wood and milk cans everywhere. Oh, by the way, the milk cans were empty, so there was no reason to cry over spilled milk. But the roof and one of the ends was salvaged and turned into a shed. I wanted to model an area what may look like 12 years later. So I scattered some stained and splintered wood car siding and some broken and dented rusty milk cans to create this. I did this on both sides of the standard gauge tracks. This is another way we can tell a story with our layout. This scene is totally fabricated and made up. So this is Red's Lobster Shack, a repair shop for local lobstermen. This is also one of the other kits on my layout. My wife saw this Deerfield River laser kit at a train show and said it was cute and I should get it. Who's going to argue with that? On the prototype, a large grain building sat in this site, but was too big to include on my layout. But this model and scene is a good stand-in. Today, a walk-up restaurant called Red's sits close to this spot. It was voted having the best lobster rolls in all of New England. And it's one of our favorite places to stop when we're in visiting Wiscasset. So remember the inspirational scene from the book cover? Here's how it turned out. So I rebuilt the three structures after meeting Peter Barney at the 2014 Narrow Gauge Convention in Kansas City. I showed him photos of my early efforts, and he offered his scale drawings that he made based on years of research. I built them as deep flats against the backdrop. Oh, that brings us to lesson 5. Don't be afraid to go back and redo things. Just like the waterfront structures on the last slide. A lot of my layout was rebuilt at least once. Structures, rail cars, even track. Sometimes good enough is not good enough. Looking from the other end of the wharf, we have on the left the Wiscasset Grain Building, the Wiscasset Lumber Building, and the Turner Creamery. In addition to moose, Maine is known for lobsters. Here, a local lobsterman is pulling on his wellies before taking his dory out to run his trap line. The water was poured using Envirotex Light over the painted wood bottom. The waves are made using gloss gel medium, then dry brushed along the tops with white acrylic. A few coats of gloss medium over that softens the look of the white caps. The dory on the left is a kit from, I can't remember who, and the little sailboat was something I just found a casting at some train show clearance table. Here's a view of the Turner Creamery with the reefer that carried Vern down from Albion. It sits on one of the two spurs built on the same trestle as the main line. The creamery is built to the correct height and width, but the length was selectively compressed to fit against the wall. That other boxcar on the left is a kit from Train Troll. I have 2 of Andy's kits on my layout. Here we are looking from the wooden road bridge built to carry people and cars across the river. The road heads into town and curves up to the left. The creamery is on the left and Red's is on the right. Those storefronts in the backdrop are photos of N-scale DPM building kits that were attached to the backdrop. The models now sit on my grandson's layout. This is another simple example of forced perspective. This road still exists today and is now US Highway 1 and continues south all the way to milepost 0 in Key West, Florida. This is one of my favorite views of the waterfront. I think it just looks cool. I love how all the waterfront structures line up. It's hard to tell they're building flats at this angle. You can also see how the road bridge interconnects with the railroad trestle. This trestle was built very early when construction started. In the corner next to the waterfront is my selectively relocated engine service facility. It was part of the large yard area north of town on the prototype. Engine 3 sits beside the scratch-built 3-stall roundhouse. It was built full size, but the far stall was truncated against the backdrop. There was also a water column here that I rebuilt recently and moved it from the left side of the roundhouse closer to the turntable. The turntable was kit bashed from a Portland Locomotives kit. That large coal storage shed in the background was built as a flat. The railroad built this later to store their coal supply. There is a hopper flat sticking out from the door that was built using one truck and part of a car built on top. This view of the front of the roundhouse can only be seen with that rollaway section pulled out. Here, stalls 1 and 2 are occupied, while the third was modeled with the door closed, since it wasn't used by the prototype in 1925. It's a shame I can't see this every day, but when it's rolled back, I can't see it. Let's take a look at my locomotive roster. So it started with, when I was reading through all the materials on the prototype, I would have trouble keeping everything straight. What happened and when? So I created a series of timelines to record the information as I find it. I used this form to document the changes of the various subjects, whether it's towns, changes of rolling stock, corporate structure, and the locomotives. So the subject or event was listed along the columns on the left. The years are listed across the top. You'll notice I started at 1900 because I knew I wanted to model sometime in the 1900s. So here's the one I built for the locomotive roster. You can see that on the left-hand column, the prototype owned 9 engines during its existence. The dark green bands indicate when the locomotive was in service on the railroad. The yellowish bands to the left show the years it had prior ownership. Then the light greenish blue bands on the right show when it was out of service. By adding a line through 1925, I can easily see what was in service in the period I model. And the yellow highlights on the left column show the locomotives in service on my layout. Let's have a look at them. So all of my locomotive models started out as Bachmann Forneys. Number 7 here was the first engine I purchased back in 2011. I made alterations to bring it closer to the prototype, which was a Baldwin-built, outside braced, 28-ton 244. I replaced the stock pilot and cab with kits from Out Blue models. I purchased the flared top tank from Bachmann directly and rearranged a few details on the boiler. The stock decoder was replaced with a Soundtrax TSU 750 and current keeper. Number 4 started as an inside frame 244 Bachmann model. I kit bashed it into a Porter-built 28-ton 044. I removed the front truck and shortened the pilot by cutting off the front of the metal casting. Then I added a Mount Blue model wood pilot. The boiler was scratch built from a copper water pipe. The boiler details were reused from the stock model. The cab was scratch built from styrene, and the tank was modified by rounding the flare top front. This locomotive has a steam dome inside the cab, and you can see the steam whistle sticking out through the hole in the roof. I installed a Soundtrax Economy ECO 100 decoder with a current keeper. I may go back and update it with a newer Tsunami 2 since I like some of the newer functions. I wrote an article about this locomotive that Bob Brown published in the March-April 2017 Gazette. This is my latest project. It was building number 3, a Portland-built 18-ton 044 using a Bachmann Forney again. I removed the lead truck and shortened the pilot. This time I used the stock switching style pilot. The boiler is scratch built from a copper water pipe again. One of the keys was getting those fluted domes. Fortunately, Shapeways had the perfect 3D printed designs available. The cab was scratch built with the distinctive double curved roof, and the tank was shortened. The big leap of faith came when I had to cut the frame between the drivers and the trailing truck. There was no going back once I did that. A new styrene deck helps hold it all together. A Tsunami 2 decoder helps make this the best running engine in the fleet. There's an article about this locomotive in the 2021 ON30 annual. Going back to the layout, here's a view from the room entry door looking left. This is the transfer yard where a freight was moved between the 2 railroads. The main central boxcar is a Portland locomotive kit with some cheap O-scale trucks I had on hand. In addition to being a key freight spot, the scene helps visitors see the difference in size between the narrow and standard gauge railroads. The narrow gauge boxcar nearby is number 82. It was built by the prototype to carry hay. I added a Soundtrax sound card decoder and current keeper to the model. The decoder is programmed to produce sounds typical of cars underway, such as clickety-clack and flange squeal, etc. This also adds another task for the crew. They need to add and subtract this car from their consist. Here's some of my other freight cars. I currently have 12. 2 are kits from Train Troll, the rest are scratch built. Boxcar 503 was built board by board with pre-stained basswood. The red paint was dry brushed over the wood. I find this method more effective in achieving a weathered look than trying to apply weathering to a newly painted car. The car was used to carry potatoes. There was a smoke jack on the left of the roof and a small stove inside that was used to keep the potatoes from freezing during those brutal Maine winters. You should see this boxcar, you should see this boxcar in the current July-August Gazette, which I haven't seen my copy yet. The model is based on the prototype that was built for the Wiscasset in Quebec in 1894 as car number 34. Originally, it came with a low roof, but the railroad rebuilt it in the early 1900s by raising the roof to increase capacity. You can see how some of the siding is horizontal across the top. By 1925, it had received a lot of patches to repair rot. Once again, I used pre-stained wood strips and applied the boxcar red using a dry brush technique. By the way, the car still exists today. Over 125 years later, Bob Bennett of Maine took this photo for me last October at the Booth Bay Railway Museum. It was repainted to represent the original configuration, but you can see the horizontal boards on the far end where they raised the roof. You saw this car earlier. It's called a hopper flat. It's nothing more than a beefed up flat car with some stakes and long boards to keep the coal load from spilling on the ground. That structure in the background is the building flat that represents the house that the dairy owned and was occupied by Vern Stearns and Ken Thurston. Those were real people that were employed by the dairy. This is another detail I enjoy adding on this small railroad. Researching the people and the stories that helped make this railroad run 100 years ago. As I mentioned before, sawn lumber was a key commodity for the railroad, and most of it was moved on simple flat cars, such as number 116. This is one of the very few flat cars that had actual road reporting marks. Most just had the car numbers painted on the side. Here it sits on the wharf track waiting to be moved and unloaded. I built several lumber load stacks that can be removed to allow me to run load in and load out on the wharf. Speaking of the wharf, this is the area that was the last major construction project of the railroad. The design came about using a lot of full-scale mock-ups. I copied full-scale drawings and glued them to foam core, then cut them out and make three-dimensional models. Everything here except for the schooner on the left are mock-ups. Even the flat wharf itself is a sheet of foam core I spray painted brown and attached some rails. I would move some stuff around and would send photos to other Maine 2-foot folks I know to get their input. So this was a great collaborative effort on the design. The schooner was built first, so I could design everything else around it. Started construction by first painting the water black. Then I started laying out the grid of pilings, using a square and straight edge to keep everything true and spaced evenly. You can see how I used pink foam and Sculptamold for the base scenery in the background. Additional blending would take place as I built the wharf. Here are the nearly 80 pilings sunk into the river bottom. Each one is glued into holes drilled into the plywood. I didn't make a scale drawing for the wharf, but just started laying it out and tweaking it as I went. Next, I added marine growth to the pilings. I really should have done that first before gluing them into the holes. On later pilings, I would paint the lower part of the dowel with grimy black up to the high water mark, then add some white glue over the grimy black, and then dip it into yellow-green superleaf material. A bit of India ink wash after will tone down that color. And this is the method I used later on in the layout. On the top are wooden beams. Then I attached wood joists running perpendicular to the beams, but I didn't show them here. You can see how I started to blend the bank into the river bottom with Sculptamold in the back. Finally, the decking was installed, one board at a time. I've been asked how many boards did I install. I honestly have no idea, but you're welcome to count. This would be a great drone shot if they had drones in 1925, but it does give you a nice overall view of the wharf, which is about 19 inches square. Next, I needed to determine what to include on the wharf to support its operations. I found this old poster from the 1890s on Google Images. It advertised steamship service to several coastal towns, including Wiscasset. These steamship lines operated sort of like bus companies of the 20th century. I wanted to include structures that would support the operations of the Steamship Silesia in this sketch up here. Even though most of the steamship lines had ceased operations by 1925. I started by building the Pier Station using Wes Yule's drawings. I'm using it as a station where passengers can transfer between the railroad and coastal steamships. I wrote about this station in the November-December 2019 Gazette. If you look closely, you can see an image of that steamship from the poster on the side of the station. I also built a set of stairs and a floating dock to help the folks off the steamship and up to the station. By the way, I cut all my wood shingles using 1/64 inch thick plywood. I cut them into scale 12-inch wide strips, stack them, and make 6-inch deep cuts using a homemade fixture. This gives me strips and roughly a 6-inch reveal. I produced a lot of shingles for this structure and the others around the layout. This is the Steamship Silesia. It was scratch built based on that sketch of the poster. I developed my own scale drawings, including the lines to shape the hull. It was constructed from wood using plank on bulkhead method. I had to reduce its length, but I'm otherwise think she looks pretty seaworthy. Here's a view from the stern. In addition to passengers, she would carry small amounts of freight as seen on the lower deck. Adding details has been a fun part of building this model. This is an overall view of the wharf with the two-masted schooner front and center. The wharf looks like a busy place today. The schooner and steamship sit on wood dowels that make them removable. I didn't want to permanently glue them down to the water. I scratch built the schooner in 2017 and named her after my late mother, Dorothy Glenn. That boat hanging from the stern was built from a kit that was really nothing more than a box of sticks. I wanted it to look like it had seen better days, but I'm not sure how seaworthy it is now. This is a view from off the bow. I had built model sailing ships in my youth, and like most ship models builders, I typically would make them under full sail or with them furled or simply without sails. But I wanted the Dorothy Glenn to have her sails simply lowered. These ships were manned with a crew of only 2 or 3, so they wouldn't have taken the time to stow the sails properly for a few hours they spent loading or unloading cargo. These ships were converted into bulk carriers and known as coasters. They rarely left the side of the land as they moved lumber, stone, coal, or even lime up and down the coast. Here we see the crew loading the last of the sawn lumber. The main hold is filled, and this crew member is installing the hatch covers. This is another area that differs from ship modeling. We model railroaders want to include dynamic scenes such as this. Here, the forward hatch has been battened down, and they're stacking lumber on the deck. They would drive a single nail through each board to secure the load to the deck. Once the stack reached up to the gunnels, they would stack them across or thwart ships until the scuppers, those little drainage things on the bottom there, were nearly awash. They didn't worry too much about sinking since the whole thing was made out of wood. So I brought the Dorothy Glenn to the 2018 Lone Star Convention outside of Austin, Texas. On the 2.5-hour drive from Houston, I kept thinking to myself, who would bring a ship to a model railroad convention? I stewed about it for a few days during the event, but was quite surprised and pleased on Saturday evening when she won Best in Show. I'm still known as the guy who brought a ship to a railroad convention. In addition to lumber, the wharf received shiploads of coal that was used by the railroad and online customers. The coal was unloaded from the ship using a derrick powered by a steam winch. I couldn't find any clear photos, so I just made up the design on this layout. The coal would be shoveled by hand from the hold of the ship into this bucket down here that would be attached to the derrick, and then they could lift it. Once it lifted, they would dump it onto the hand carts on top of this elevated tramway. This view also gives a good look at the series of tall pilings that keep the ships from bumping against the wharf itself. The loaded cart would then be wheeled into the coal shed and dumped into the bins along either side. This coal shed was modeled with a 3-degree lean using lots of pre-steamed lumber and strip wood. No scale drawings were available. I found lots of good photos to guide me. By 1925, the coal shed, the tramway, and the derrick were removed. But with encouragement from fellow modelers, I decided to include them anyway. Here's one last look at the railroad wharf from the back. On the left, you can see the doors on the side of the Pier Station. I imagine this is where the baggage and freight from the steamship traffic was stored. On the turret roof, you can see up here, is an orange pennant. Ships would use this as a visual to gauge the wind speed and direction when they're trying to dock. The center area of the wharf was kept pretty clear of clutter. You can see the handcart on the elevated tramway between the two masts of the ship here. And you can see a lot of Albion in the background. Sorry, I should have shot this with a sky background. Maybe next time. The coal shed on the right had a track that entered through the opening visible on the right. I modeled it with an abandoned track. A Ford truck was backed in to pick up a load of coal needed by someone in town. This truck was kit-bashed from plans published in a Gazette from a few years ago. So I've included operations on just about every layout I've built, but I thought, could I build a reasonable operating system for this small layout? I break down operations for me into two parts: moving cars, moving trains. So moving cars is really nothing more than car forwarding. But narrow gauge layouts can provide a challenge that most standard gauge railroads don't. My cars never leave the layout. Oh, and they never enter either. But during my review of the research materials on the railroad, I documented freight that moved on the railroad. Here's some examples of what moved from Albion to Wiscasset and from Wiscasset to Albion, the two main towns I modeled. So this indicated there was plenty of traffic on their prototype to justify moving cars. I've been using car cards with 4-cycle waybills for years on my N-scale layout, but I knew 4-cycle waybills wouldn't work on such a small layout with about a dozen cars. It would be too repeatable. So I learned about single waybills from the OpSigs newsletter, the dispatcher's office, from several years ago. I created my waybills using Excel and printed them to fit into the micromark cards I already had on hand. So here's an example of how I used them to move a load of potatoes from Albion to Wiscasset. So they're going to need a boxcar at the potato warehouse because there's nothing available in Albion. But boxcar 503 is sitting empty in the Wiscasset yard. So the local agent needs to tag it with an empty car order. I have a variety of these made for different types of cars in the industry locations. I printed them on blue heavy paper to make them stand out. Placing the empty car order in the car sleeve, the crew is now authorized to move it from Wiscasset to the potato warehouse in Albion. Once it arrives in the warehouse, the empty car order is replaced with the waybill. It can now be loaded and moved to Wiscasset. I actually wrote about this car forwarding method in my first Gazette article back in January, February of 2016. This has been a fun way to simulate the movement of freight and cars on a small layout with no typical staging. Here's my car 503 at the potato warehouse in Albion. I've just added this narrow slot on the fascia. It's a great place to put the waybill car cards. It allows the crew to sort them during switching moves without laying them on the scenery. I got this idea from a recent clinic by Lee Rainey. Here's a shot of the two-man crew working the Wiscasset waterfront. Engineer Lucas waits patiently for his brother Peter to sort the waybills and figure out the next move. In case you hadn't figured it out, they're the namesakes for the Peterborough and Lucasville Railroad. Moving trains is the other part of operations for me. So the prototype ran 1 or 2 scheduled mixed trains each day from Albion to Wiscasset. The trains run sequentially back and forth. It takes me about 2 to 2.5 hours to complete the 2 round trips with switching. I use these train cards to help the crew. As you can see, I'm adding a list of instructions specific to the train along the bottom. They are a work in progress as I add and subtract instructions along the bottom as I figure it all out. I'll print new cards once I settle on everything. Then the train cards fit into the micromark locomotive cards that came with the original kit I purchased years ago. As you can see, I've added keys for the decoder function, since like most of you, I can't remember half the time what buttons to push. This card will be clipped to the front of the stack of the waybill cards needed for the crew to move their train and consist. I mentioned the railroad ran mixed trains. That means passenger cars, and I have 2 on my layout. Number 2 is an Rpo Combine, and it's based on the prototype car. I kit bashed it using a Bachmann 36-foot ON30 car, adding new sides and ends from Deerfield River Laser. They're called quick kits. They're laser cut sides and ends. The result isn't an exact scale model of the prototype, but is very close. I then added a Soundtrack sound card decoder and current keeper that controls 2 LEDs inside. In addition to lights, the decoder adds some sound effects typically heard from this moving car: clickety clack, flange and brake squeal, and wheel flat spots. Once again, the crew needs to take time to add and subtract this to their consist. One issue I had with the kit and the model is it's too wide compared to the prototype and the other cars in the layout. I recently built coach number 12 using another Bachmann model and a Deerfield River kit, but this time I also used their prototype with car ends. I had to narrow the frame and the roof, but it turned out a lot better and was a lot easier than I expected. I used an old single function decoder I had on hand to turn the interior lights on and off. Here it sits in front of the Wiscasset station. I may go back and do something with that Rpo Combine and make it narrow at some point. In case you were wondering about the prototype, on June 15, 1933, train number 8 was running southbound near Whitefield with a flat car, boxcar, reefer, and an Rpo Combine when the outer rail on a curve broke. Engine 8 slid down the embankment and stopped short of the water. The crew walked away with the mail, and the railroad ceased operations. The railroad never turned a wheel again in revenue service. The rails were eventually pulled up, and this locomotive was scrapped in place. By the way, this photo came from Gary Kohler's online research library. It's a subscription service, but it's a really great resource for prototype modelers like me. But one locomotive survived, and it was stored on a farm in Connecticut for decades. It's been restored and is running at the Wiscasset, Waterville, and Farmington Museum. Here, I took a shot during the 2016 Narrow Gauge Convention in Augusta. And by the way, I am a life member of this museum. So, looking back, did this railroad layout fulfill my dreams? To satisfy my need to build models? I'd say so. To be based on the prototype with liberal doses of selective compression, relocation, etc.? I think so. And to be contained within a spare bedroom and be presentable during the build? Well, my wife may disagree with the presentable, but I'll give it a check mark. And that there be no rush to complete. This could be my forever layout. Well, since I'm almost done, I don't know. Let's go back and review the 6 lessons I learned on downsizing. First, be creative in finding ways to use what could be unusable space. 2, force perspective and good backdrops can help make it appear bigger. 3, adding small tasks for the crew can extend the run and make the layout feel longer. 4, take time to add details that you may not have time on a larger layout. I'm still adding details to this layout. 5, don't be afraid and go back and fix those little things that may not be quite right. Oh, and 6, never apologize for the size of your layout. Thanks for listening, y'all.
Hey, thanks, Pete. That was really great. We no longer have an excuse to not build a layout because we don't have enough space. You really made some creative use of what you had. Let me go down the list of some of the questions we had. Tom Sullivan said, Pete, can you talk a little bit about your decision to use ON30 rather than going to the 2-foot scale or gauge?
It was quite simple, availability of models. There just simply isn't enough ON2 stuff available. I think Ron King, who's on the call here, and my friend Al Chirella in Georgia, they probably bought all the ON2 models that were available.
Okay.
And by the way, at the height that you build it, I dare you to tell the difference in that 6 inches looking at the putt.
Yeah. Hugh says, great layout, Peter, thanks. One man says, Don says, what's next?
Well, I'm actually working on an HON 30 Forney locomotive that I just got from Toma Model Works out of Japan. It is the best running mechanism I've ever seen. And I'm in the process of figuring out how I'm going to scratch build something on top of it.
Super. Well, we thank you very much. I did notice one thing. I saw your presentation during a dry run, and I never noticed the workbench before that's built into your bench work. You need to show us a picture of that sometime.
Yeah, I have two workbenches in there on either side, one with a
Ah.
TV and one with better lighting. So I actually have two televisions, flat screens in the room. There's also a mini fridge. My wife said if there was a bathroom in there, I may never come out.
Pete, thanks again for a wonderful
You're
presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you much.
Russ, I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Pete, and thank you, Pete, for your beautiful presentation.